Louise is the ancestress of Diana, the Princess of Wales, as well as Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall. She was the Duchess of Portsmouth and a true political force at court. As King Charles II, head mistress, she had a profound ability to push and pull the strings of international diplomacy and politics between England and France via the courts and King Charles II himself. Louise was born in September 1649 into a noble but secretly penniless family. During and after the English Civil War, like many other families, they found themselves in worsening poor financial conditions. However, in order to keep up their noble status, they took in many exiled royalists. Louise attended school at a convent, then came home to her parents' estate in Brittany. Once she was finished with school in 1668, through her noble status, she was sought after to become a lady-in-waiting for Henriette-Anne, the wife of Duke d'Orleans, Louis XIV's brother. Henriette-Anne was also the much-adored younger sister of Charles II, who lovingly called her Minette. She was known for sex scandals in the French court, despite her childlike appearance and assumed innocence. Louise, however, maintained her innocence and reputation throughout. Being the lady-in-waiting for Charles' second younger sister put Louise in the French court's radar and also led her to meet the king. Louise met Charles in 1670 during the summer. She had travelled from France to England with Minette to visit her royal siblings. Minette had a secret endeavour, however, that would lead to Louise meeting the king. She was sent on a mission to pass on a message between Charles II and Louis XIV regarding the secret Treaty of Dover. Louise spectated how capable Minette was at playing the political role of the messenger. Upon returning to France, Minette became grossly ill and complained of being in agonizing pain. She died quickly afterwards after hours of calling out in pain that she was poisoned. Her brother Charles II was grievously devastated and accused Minette's husband and his lover for poisoning her. Louise was suddenly without a role in the French court, and so she waited patiently for news of a new appointment. The Duchess of Cleveland, George Villiers, 2nd Duke of Buckingham, organised for Louise to come to England to comfort Charles with the hope to use her to spy. Louis XIV saw a chance to use this French beauty to strengthen his negotiating power by using Louise as a tool to influence Charles II's decisions in the French interest. Louise made an extremely great impression when she first met Charles, and he quickly invited her to live within the English court. Louise began her task to influence his decisions for France's interests. As his sister's good friend, she began by convincing him that his sister had not been poisoned by her husband or his male lover, lending a pretty and kind shoulder to cry on. Their closeness had already been rumoured as a relationship, and this was started by courtiers who would benefit from ridding the king of his existing mistresses, Barbara and Nell. Louise was young and virginal and knew the risks of being an unmarried woman succumbing to a man's desires, and so it would be some time before she would give in to Charles. She wanted to be as certain as she could that his intentions were true and pure. Louise and Charles' relationship was officially declared in 1671 when she stayed at the Euston home of Lord Arlington during a party that lasted 15 days. The French ambassador invited Louise to the party in order to establish her position of royal mistress in the English courts. It didn't take long to catch the king's attention and draw him away from his current mistresses and wife. The influence and affection for Barbara and Nell was decreasing as they were growing old and their looks were beginning to fade. Nell was pregnant with his second son, but she was still abruptly dumped by the king at her house in Newmarket. Louise had been in the English court for a year up to now, and she was still keeping the king on his toes by not giving in to his desires. This seemed to make the king desire her even more. Her plan worked, and she won her place as head mistress and the favourite, when she finally succumbed to him after days of drinking, feasting, and some very public displays of affection. The pair did not struggle to conceive an illegitimate child of Charles, and 10 months later a son was born called Charles. This cemented her place in the king's heart. She was then awarded a pension of £10,000 a year, which was very different to the lifestyle she was used to as a child. In 1673, she was given the role of lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. Louise was allegedly to be very respectful, and therefore her relationship with the Queen was much easier than it was with the flamboyant and bragging ex-mistress Barbara. Charles continued to gift more prestigious roles to Louise, and much quicker than her rivals. She was honoured with the status of Duchess of Portsmouth, Baroness Peterfield, and Countess of Fareham. At just 3 years old, he gave his son the title Duke of Richmond, Earl of March, and Baron of Setrington on the 9th of August 1675. The following month he was given the Scottish titles of Duke of Lennox, Earl of Darnley, and Lord of Torbolton. This infuriated Barbara and Nell, whom also had Charles' children, but had failed to advocate for their dukedoms. Louise had caught the attention of the king because she was so different to Barbara and Nell, who were ill-tempered and feisty. She was much more reserved, respectable, and polished, and offered a kind and soft shoulder to lean on. She knew how to please the king. He preferred a soft and sensitive woman, and she used gentleness and tears to influence him to do what she wanted. She was known to be very emotionally unstable and would tear up often. This infuriated Nell, who could see that Louise was purposely manipulating the king, using her emotions, and so she would go on to nickname her the Weeping Willow. Nell was very witty and would make fun and torment Louise, who could not defend herself with enough wit to win their engagements, leaving her feeling deflated and reeling with anger. Nell even spread rumours that Louise wore dirty underclothes and called her Squintabella. Ironically, the pair became unlikely friends and often played cards or took afternoon tea together, though Nell's teasing of Louise never really stopped. Barbara's jealousy showed in a very different way, and she would try to get one over on Louise by upstaging her whenever she could. She once rode around town with 8 horses after Louise had taken only 6 horses to the races. This did not last long though, and Barbara eventually backed down when she realised that Louise would always upstage her in class. Louise would host huge parties and masquerade balls, bringing fun and glamour to the court. Her entertainments were as legendary as her manners, and for some time she was the talk of Whitehall. Louise saw herself as the king's one and only woman, and so when he would be distracted by other women, she was deeply hurt and distraught. The Queen was unfazed at this point and had learnt to never expect the king to remain faithful. Louise was left traumatized and locked herself away when she contracted venereal disease in 1674 from Charles' endeavours with other women. As an apology, he gifted her a large diamond worth a total of £10,000. And in 1675, the king ran off with yet another woman for a whole year, leaving the Duchess laying in bed crying the whole time. The affair did not last long, and she was back in Charles II's bed and back in his favour. Perhaps in retaliation, later in 1682, Louise began an affair with a handsome young French nobleman, Philippe de Vendôme, when Charles' other mistress Barbara returned to England after living in France for 6 years. When Charles found out about her affair, he was crushed and furious by the so-called betrayal. He sent one of his advisers to insist that Vendôme leave Louise alone. When the nobleman refused to stop his affair with Louise, Charles threatened him until he forced him to France several months later. This blip in their relationship only seemed to make Charles' love for his mistress grow further, as he immediately forgave his fubs. After the incident, he seemed to be more in love with her than ever. It was believed that despite having other mistresses, she was his one true love. It was evident by the full-length portrait of her that hung in his bedchamber that he was devoted to her. It is alleged that he was so impressed by her beauty and intelligence and ability to influence the political world, despite her own unpopularity with the public. She remained by his side throughout all and any political strife. Life was not always enjoyable for the Duchess of Portsmouth. She was loved by the king as his chief mistress. However, she was not loved by the English public or by aristocrats. She was despised for being both French and Catholic, as well as rising rapidly in wealth and status, despite being a minor noble. She had great power over the king and could therefore influence politics in favour of France's interests. In 1680, the mistress was accused of treason, trying to alter the government in church and state, and plotting to introduce popery and tyranny in the three kingdoms. Over the 10 years that she was in court, Louise's power grew exponentially, and the innocent and sensitive girl who had first arrived in England was replaced by a powerful woman. Despite how many people loathed her place at the king's side and her influence was blatant. The Queen and the Duchess had an amicable relationship until even she was convinced that Louise was abusing her position to influence the king's decisions. Louise's power came to a crashing halt when Charles died in February of 1685. However, she would have her final wish granted when she persuaded the king to convert to the Roman Catholic faith, something she had been aiming to do for 15 years. While Charles lay dying, she summoned the French ambassador, Paul Barillon, to her chambers and told him that the king had wished to die as a Catholic. After convincing the Duke of York and Queen Catherine, both Catholics themselves, to make this happen, a chaplain was sent for. The chaplain recited the Holy Communion, and the following day the king died, a Catholic. Charles requested that his brother James II to look after the Duchess, but he made very little effort to ensure her personal comfort at court. She was quickly forgotten and was left isolated and alone, so she moved back to France in 1685 with her son. To top off the bitter end to her favour in the English courts, William III then blocked Louise and her son's pensions and other income, leaving her begging for help from King Louis XIV of France. The French king granted her an allowance of £12,000 per year, and her son, the Duke of Richmond, £20,000 per year. However, compared to the extravagance she was used to, this seemed like a kick in the teeth, and she was isolated from the rest of the royal society as a result. Louise's influence did not end outside of the English courts, and she would go on to plead to make changes to the taxes for those that served in the military. She had witnessed firsthand the poverty that her tenants and local peasants were experiencing, particularly because of a terrible frost in the winter of 1692. This was also self-serving, as people were beginning to abandon the township and the estate that she lived on and relied on. Louise was left with crippling expenses due to the cost to look after her estate and land, and eventually she went crawling back to England in 1698 to plead to William III to reinstate her pensions. Despite her pleas for help, she was only promised £1,000 from the king after attending court for 5 months, so her debts only grew higher as she failed to curb her frivolous spending. She was so used to her life of riches and privilege being the mistress of Charles II that she could not adapt to her new life as a minor noblewoman. She did continue to be influential in court and was seen as someone of importance who was treated with respect. Louise would go on to sell off much of her lands in return for some financial stability. Her crippling debts were partially paid when Louis XIV died in 1712, leaving her a large annuity of £24,000 for her services to France. The Duchess of Portsmouth died on the 14th of November 1734 at an impressive age of 85 years old, and she was buried in the Church of Barefooted Carmelites in Abergele. Please comment, like and subscribe if you wish for more stories, and leave your suggestions below and I will endeavour to cover them.